On today's episode, we discuss how being pro-life and pro-Second Amendment are mutually exclusive. Take on a classic article headline from The Onion about how mass shootings and murder only ever happen in America. Learn about what Jesus had to say on gun ownership. Contemplate doing a trial year of strict gun control. And finally, learn that if gun control saves even one life, it is worth doing. This is Cringe Posts. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of the Cringe Post podcast. This is the podcast where we gather the cringiest political and cultural takes that we see in our feeds every week. We break down where they went wrong, point out some of the underlying assumptions, have a little bit of a laugh along the way. I'm here with my co-host Donnie. My name's Britt. And before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our show. It really helps us. And if you are listening to the audio-only version of this podcast, we have a visual show companion that you can go look at, all of these different memes and pictures and cringe posts. If you go to cringepost.com. Before we, take shots at other people and take on their own bad takes, we like to take on our own just to show that, we can poke fun at ourselves and we can grow as well. And I've got a post from Donald Kimball, November 20th, 2010. And your Facebook post writes, "Writing an 8-minute speech is awful."
Ooh, it's so hard.
Man, what happens when you get into the workplace?
I know. This feels like those, the first time you ever have to write like a 1-page report, as a kid, and you're like, how am I going to fill up a whole page? I love it because I think also there is a little bit of what I thought was kind of a brag in there, because it was my sophomore year of high school, I believe. And the high school I went to had 4 years of speech classes, which was not typical. And so it was a little bit like a flex on my contemporaries who didn't have a speech class. I was kind of trying to rub in a little bit like, oh my gosh, I have it so hard. I have to write an 8-minute speech, even though I'm in high school. This is so much work, and I'm so advanced in this way. And it's just pathetic because, one, I'm complaining about something that is not difficult. 2, I'm complaining about, like, even at the time, if I'm trying to learn and grow and get challenged from this, it's supposed to do that for me. So, like, don't complain about that. It's part of the process. And then also, it's just really not that impressive, even though I'm
Do you remember what it was on?
I don't remember what it was specifically on. If I went back, I could probably find it, but yeah, I don't remember there being any particularly challenging topics in the speech class. At most, it was probably like a persuasive speech of some kind. That would be my guess. Is you had a topic and you had to make some form of an argument. You had to make some sort of compelling, persuasive case, either comparing two products or maybe trying to convince people of a particular idea of one way or the other. So, 8-minute speech is not that awful, Donald. You can get over yourself.
No,
and stop
I mean,
trying to flex.
yeah. You did debate in college, I remember stuff. So it's little did you know that you would be speaking on lots of different things for a long time later. Right.
Well, but I didn't write those speeches, so that's the difference. They're extemporaneous versus written.
True, very true.
Yeah.
I have similar posts in my past, like about like writing papers and stuff, and like your 1-page paper. Like I think I wrote something about I had to write a 7-page paper, double spaced.
Yeah.
So it's really 3.5 pages.
Yeah, with citations and sources.
Yes. Oh man, and a cover page.
Yeah.
All right. Trust us, homeschooling was actually really good. We actually did learn and do stuff. All right, getting into our first cringe post of the day. We've got 2 posts here. One is a picture of a banner hanging on a house, and it says, "Our government is bold enough to force you to have a kid, but too weak to ensure they make it to recess alive." And then Julia, do you know how to say her last name?
I guess Loff, I'm not sure.
Julia Loff, verified on Twitter, also tweets out, "What if you could perform an abortion with an AR-15? What if the 19 kids killed in Uvalde weren't children, but fetuses?" Well, oh my gosh, that is just an awful, what an awful thing to say on Julia's part. I'll take on the first one. So it's really interesting. Like, we've seen in the past few days news come out about how the cops basically showed up at the school while the shooter was active, didn't stop the shooter from entering. He was shooting outside of the school for 12 minutes beforehand, didn't stop him from entering. Once he did enter, they spent 40 minutes, kind of deliberating about how to go in to stop him. And one of the things I think is really, there's nothing good about that, but one of the good cultural things that happens with that is I think people start to realize like, hey, you have to take care of yourself, right? There's no, the government is too weak to take care of you. And so I do kind of agree with that, right? Like the government is too weak to make sure your kids stay alive. It is your responsibility to make sure they are. So stop pretending that that you can only have police have guns, right? There are parents there that were armed, that were literally being tased or handcuffed because they wanted to go in and save their kids, and the police didn't want them to do so. The problem is this person's logic about the government's power like stops there. It's like the government shouldn't be involved in any of this stuff because the government can't change anything, right? If you can't actually bring a solution to the table, if you're not going to be part of making something work, then you shouldn't even be there in the first place. And the government is forcing people to have children, right? That's the other aspect of this. Like they're not forcing them to have children. They're just saying, hey, once you do have a kid, you can't abort them, right? And then on top of it, we've engaged in this before, but with Roe v. Wade, it's really just returning the decision to the states. So this person just gets so caught up in the just the emotional argument of comparing abortion and Roe v. Wade to this shooting, because it both involves kids, and it's a really disingenuous argument that really holds no water or makes no point. But it's really emotionally compelling, right? Because people can kind of make a little bit of connection because there's some similarities, but there's not an actual argument there because none of it relates together.
Yeah, and I mean that's the exact case with the second tweet here as well, where it's an entirely emotional appeal where you take vaguely similar concepts and then try to mash them together with no coherence whatsoever. It's only an argument that's going to resonate with people who already agree with it. I could be mistaken, but I don't know anyone on the edge or who thinks deeply about these issues who would be persuaded by this kind of thing. However, if you are very foggy and unfamiliar with the territory, the takeaway is this emotional, well, yeah, they really do love the guns, even though guns are used to kill people, and they really hate abortion. Why is that not adding up? And you don't really think about the specifics of the tweet. So looking at it line by line here, it's like, what if you could perform an abortion with an AR-15? We would still hate it. Like, yeah. that's the single stupidest thing that anyone can say about either of these scenarios. The fundamental difference between the idea of defending the Second Amendment and the idea of protecting guns rights, and the difference between that versus something like abortion and saying that abortion is wrong and should not be allowed. The fundamental difference is abortion is a procedure and a gun is a tool. And so a gun, when you're saying, guns should be legal, you are not saying we need to encourage, we need to legalize, we need to enforce mass shootings. That's not what people are saying. Now, that's what people who are against gun rights say that the other side is saying. That's what they are saying in effect. Conservatives or people, libertarians or whomever are defending gun rights want. They're saying they want to encourage that sort of behavior, but that's not the case. And there's an important distinction there. In the same way that I can say that you should be free to do, you should be free to gamble your money. That does not mean I condone gambling your money. I think gambling your money is an idiotic thing to do. It's a destructive behavior. But I think you should be free to do it. I don't think I should be, make a law that you shouldn't be able to do that. And it's in the same way. It's like, I think that obviously committing a mass shooting is a horrible, awful thing, and you should not do that. However, you should not be able to take away the rights of people to defend themselves from that kind of behavior just because some people are going to use that in bad faith. And as you pointed out, the broad takeaway here, it shouldn't be that, we can't let people have these guns, because the point is that all of the targeted areas are the ones where people are not allowed to have guns. That's where these mass shootings happen. Yeah. And so if you disarm these people, and then, you introduce a bad actor in there, well, of course that type of thing is going to happen because there's no way to defend it. And then the police are actively preventing people from going in and helping and deterring that sort of thing. So what if you could perform an abortion with AR-15? That changes nothing of the paradigm, changes nothing about the conversation. That's a stupid thing to say. we wouldn't support abortion if you do it with vice grips or an AR-15 or with a sponge. Like, it doesn't matter how you do the awful action of abortion. It is wrong to murder.
Yeah.
The act of abortion is wrong, not the tools of abortion.
There was literally. Sorry, go for it.
Yeah. Oh, no, please.
So that's interesting that you're saying, because there was literally someone in Norway that killed a bunch of people with blunt objects, right? I think it was 5 people, which qualifies as a mass killing, just a few weeks ago. And it's like, blunt objects are used on babies, right? Like, let's just say hypothetically it was a pair of pliers that pulls the kid out, and it's like we still wouldn't support it in that way, right? Like, and I think that's your really important, your delineation of a tool versus a procedure or an action. And it's like, yeah, an AR-15 does not make, just because you exchange one tool for the other, whether you ingest the kid with poison, or you take a bunch of tongs and pull it out, or however you do it, like, or vacuum or whatever. Like, we don't like the procedure, but I'm not going to go around banning it so people can't actually use vacuums in their house, right? That's just not the same. Same thing. I think the other thing that really struck me about this, and I think it has become really clear to me, like with COVID, is that people believe the government can do something to make things better, even though they never can. They only ever make it worse. But this belief that the government can do something forces politicians to overcorrect and do crazy amounts of reactions that make no sense, right? Create crazy externalities that create other problems, because no one can predict everything. No one can actually control everything or knows everything about everything to make the best decision. And so, like, with this gun control stuff, the thing that seems the most obvious, right, is like, emotionally, we just need to ban guns. And these people, whether out of malice or out of ignorance, will want you to be a sitting duck, right? They want parents to be trapped outside of a school as their children are slaughtered, without any ability to go in and save them, without any ability to go in and defend them. And the only people that have guns are people that are sitting outside not doing anything, right? Now imagine that's at your home, right? Because this is not just at a public school. This could also be at your home, which is, the vast majority of any sort of gun deaths or murders that occur are homicides. So just imagine you're at home, someone breaks in, you don't have a gun, but they do. And then you're reliant on these police officers that wouldn't even charge into a building to save kids to come and save you. It's not going to happen, right? And so all of this, just for people to emotionally feel better, they want you to be one of these sitting ducks that is totally defenseless. And it just reminded me a lot of, this COVID thing. Like, if it saves one life, if it makes us feel better, we'll shut down your business and force you to go out of business. It's the same kind of vibe.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, you have people kind of proposing to race to the bottom, as it were, as the policy solution, instead of realizing that everyone needs to take self-ownership and responsibility for your defense. It's, no, I would rather everyone else not be able to defend themselves either. I would rather, because of the chance that then you wouldn't, the gun wouldn't go into the wrong hands. But the problem is, fundamentally, that doesn't work. And secondarily, gun control doesn't mean that guns don't end up in the wrong hands, because then it only ends up in the wrong hands, which is the government's. The point that we've made out on this show before, we've highlighted, the sort of the great irony that all the cops are racist, but they're the only ones who should have guns, and we should arm them. And so when you're proposing these kinds of policy solutions with gun control, that's what you're advocating for. Is you're advocating that no good actors get guns, only the most corrupt monopoly on force gets guns. And even if every single actor in government right now, every police officer, every FBI agent, every politician is gloriously ethical and noble and virtuous, how long does that last before power corrupts absolutely yet again, and you don't have these perfectly ethical, virtuous, noble people, and now they're the ones with all the guns? I just don't think that that's a good solution. I don't want us to end up like Australia, where people are being whipped down and beaten to stay in their homes over a disease that is, not fatal to the vast majority of people.
Absolutely. All right. Our next one, this is one I've wanted to take on for a while. It's an Onion article, and they post it every time there is some sort of gun-related thing in the news. And the headline reads, "No way, quote, no way to prevent this, unquote, says only nation where this regularly happens." And this is a pretty common, I would say, myth that the United States is unique, exceptionally unique in its amount of gun violence and all this stuff. And what we'll probably get into this later, but you have to like kind of talk about like the definition of what qualifies as a mass shooting. I've seen people say that there's been like 230 or 213 incidents of mass shootings in 2022. But then you start looking at like what constitutes a mass shooting, and what we would probably call it's like, hey, 4 more people were killed by someone in public. And it's like, oh, only 2, right? There's only 2 so far in 2022, which is a lot, right? I'm not minimizing that or anything, but it's not like there's an event happening every week. Additionally, the five of the deadliest mass shootings in world history all took place out of the United States. So did 33 of the 50 deadliest mass shootings, right? And then if you account for population, right? People don't forget that the U.S. has one of the highest populations in the world in terms of per country. And if you account for it per capita, we actually rank 12th in terms of mass shootings per capita. And so just this whole myth, that we're somehow unique, or and that's not even accounting for like people that, like I was saying, like there was a guy that went to a grocery store with blunt objects and arrows in Norway. It's not even accounting for that, right? Like mass murders. We're just talking about mass shootings. We're not even in the top 10. And so it's just really interesting that all of this is based on a lie, and like the whole narrative is based on a lie. And so that makes me question everyone's motives, right? There's some people that genuinely believe these things, but it's like if the people who are feeding you this narrative are lying to you, and blatantly so, on data that you can literally Google and look up with a couple keystrokes, you have to ask yourself, why do they want you to disarm yourself? Why do they want you to be defenseless and to rely on them for protection? And why would you want to rely on protection from someone that is willing to lie to you and feed you a false narrative?
Yeah, there's a lot of false ways that this headline that's implicitly making an argument where you could counter it with a lot of examples. I mean, the funny thing to me is it's this headline could very equally apply to the UK and acid attacks, right? So the UK, you've got gun control. So what's one of the most common ways in a first world country that crimes and violent attacks happen there? Oh, it's acid. Literal acid burns with disfiguration and absolute horrible trauma to people. Like, oh, that's fun. No way to prevent this, says only nation where this regularly happens. You could put it that way. Or you could modify this a little bit. No way to prevent this, says only location in the US where this regularly happens, aka like schools or gun-free zones. The funny thing is, all these people are saying we just need to put in practical solutions. We need to address this. It's enough is enough. But none of them are willing to entertain the changes that would actually prevent this, where when you look at the same cultural geography and the same cultural similarities within the US, why are certain areas being attacked more than others? And the overwhelming, mass shootings occur overwhelmingly in gun-free zones. And most of the violent crime stuff happens because of gang violence. And both of those, have solutions that gun control is not a part of, right? Because gun control does not prevent gangs, which are already involved in black market deals. That's not going to change anything for the gangs, right? They already get a lot of their stuff black market, not legally. So you don't change anything there by outlawing weapon access for law-abiding citizens. And 2, outlawing, you've still prevented, or you still don't prevent outlaws, people who would get their hands on weapons without going through the proper procedures to shoot up a defenseless gun-free zone. If you were to implement actual safety regulations, you think about like when there are riots going on or any form of danger for politicians, what do? They call armed guards. They call security forces to defend them. But when it comes to the children who they put on a pedestal and they try to use as grandstanding material for these legislations, they're not willing to call in those same security guards and reinforcements for the schools or for those children that they would for themselves, because they don't actually care about their safety. They care about using this as a emotional call to pass for gun control.
Yeah. Go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to wrap up here and say that it's pretty sickening when you think about it that way, that they're willing to use these lives of these kids in that way, when they're not even doing the basic courtesy that they call for themselves.
Yeah, my favorite tweet about this was Michael Malice, which is they use kids to justify shooting adults. And it's true. That's how it goes. I mean, you look at Shanghai or any of these places where they've done mass confiscation, and all adults have basically lost their choice to do what they want to do. You are forced to do what the people with guns tell you to do, and that's what they want. All right. Moving on to our next one. This guy's a pretty public figure. Even though he's not verified, I'm going to say his name because I think he deserves to be kind of put on blast. Carlos Rodriguez, kind of a voice in the evangelical Christian circles. He tweeted out, Jesus asked religious leaders to drop their stones. Jesus asked Simon Peter to drop his sword. Jesus is asking America to drop her guns. I wonder if Carlos would say the same thing about Ukraine and us arming them and giving them weapons. You know, I actually saw he'd been posting about Ukraine earlier, and I thought it was really interesting because in both of the examples he gives about Jesus asking religious leaders and Simon Peter, he's asking them, hey, stop being the aggressor. That's what he's asking them. He's saying, Simon Peter, you know, like, don't be the aggressor. Don't, you know, no one's attacking you. They're just taking me. You don't need to cut off someone's ear or anything like that. And then the religious leaders were very obviously, right, using their stones to hurt people. And being the aggressor there. Jesus and the Bible's pretty clear about defending the innocent and pretty clear about justice and capability and competency. You know, in Matthew 19, he also, and I know there's lots of ways to interpret this, but he literally talks about, hey, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. And you can interpret that many different ways, but even in this most pacifist, you interpret that as, hey, you need to be, when you're going out onto the road, be aware of yourself and be competent and be able to, you know, defend yourself and so that you can bring my gospel to the world, right? If you're no good to the world if you are constantly being shaken down and killed or anything like that. Like, you got to be able to actually get from one place to another. Then once you're there, you know, you're going to be martyred. That's kind of the irony of all the disciples. But I think that there's this. So who's going to have the guns then, Carlos, right? Which is who is going to defend the innocent? You know, there are evil people out there in the world. Who's going to enact justice? Do you want this government that kills children in other countries, right? Do you want them to be the arbiters of justice, or do you want individual people who have a vested interest in protecting their families? The only people that have vested interest in protecting their families are their communities and the actual people within the family. The local government and all that stuff doesn't actually have an interest in doing that other than to be reelected. So I would just posit to Carlos, it's like, you know, look in the mirror, man. You know, America has a lot of things where we are being asked to drop our guns. We are being asked to drop our bombs. You know, not literally. We are being asked to stop bombing countries.
Yeah. The poor choice of words.
Yeah, poor choice of words. We are being asked to stop bombing countries. And there's a lot to go on there, and I would be really happy if he talked about that. But it appears that he only really wants to hop on this because it has some cultural significance and potential for, you know, getting him some credibility with people that don't actually believe in truth or care about truth.
Yeah, it's one of those things where people love to take individual instances of the Bible and apply it to the current geopolitical scenario and then say, look at this one example, not interpreted in context. This is the exact same thing as the cultural discussion we're having today in this entirely different time and place. And when you think about things like, well, Jesus had turned the other cheek kind of a thing, it's like that is an ethical, moral imperative. That is a very different kind of command than to say, you know, turn in your weapon that you would use to defend your family and your, you know, the most helpless in society. Those are very different kinds of things. And if you're going to cherry pick examples, well, look at the, you know, in the line of Jesus's, you know, lineage, the basically the forebearer of Christ himself in that line, King David, sort of the ultimate virtuous man, even though he made mistakes and things like that. His you know, sort of first act of nobility and of bravery was to, you know, take up his own arm, right? Arm himself with a sling and
projectile.
go and and defend his nation with, when he was not part of that military. That's like the entire story is, the Israelite army, none of them would go in and face Goliath, and he had a calling from God to do that. And I'm not going to use this as a justification to say, and therefore every single, American father of their family needs to take up an arm because the government isn't going to do it. But it does display pretty clearly that you can't just cherry pick one example from the Bible and then use that to extrapolate US policy. I think that's a really stupid thing to do. And like you said, it's all about jumping on the getting that political clout right now, that cultural clout, being perceived as with it. With the world, which is not what we are called to be. We are called to be in it and not of it. So it's frustrating because these examples that he lists are, like you said, examples of people being the aggressors in the situation. And I think it's not a handbook of how to, what policy your country should have. It's ethical principles where it's, don't initiate your violence. Don't be the aggressor. Don't go in shooting first and ask questions later. And I think that some of this could be used to critique some aspects of gun culture. But that being said, I think that that's not exactly where the impetus lies in the United States right now. Sure. I don't think that the broad cultural problems right now are that gun culture is too widely accepted. I don't think that's our issue. And if we get to that point, then yes, let's go in and we can correct some of the aspects of gun culture that I do have a problem with. But as far as our rights to own and protect, those should be absolute. You should absolutely be able to defend yourself, just as much as, like you pointed out, Jesus saying, sell your cloak and buy a sword. There's obviously some level of self-defense that we have to be able to interpret Jesus was okay with.
And it's inherent in this logic is, hey, people that have never done anything wrong that are responsible, like we're going to take, because someone else that wasn't responsible, that wasn't stopped by all of our nice rules and regulations that we think will work, wasn't stopped, you must pay the price for it. And without any regard for how guns work or the actual statistics behind the violence about what guns cause what type of violence, spoiler, it's handguns, right? These assault rifles that you talk about, these people can't even, they talk about fully semi-automatic guns. Like those are used in less than 14% of any sort of gun deaths in the world. So it's like, if you want to, in the United States, if you want to actually, like, if your policy decisions actually are logically implemented, it's like you would actually be harping on handguns, right? But they don't really do that. It's because they know that they know that the big rifle looks scary. So let's talk about that and let's do that. So it's disingenuous, and maybe Carlos is just ignorant of it all. But to me, it's a little bit more clear, when you can find something with a couple Google searches, and you choose not to do so, and then you put your opinion out there like authority with authority. It appears that he's just trying to get some clout, like you were saying. All right, our next post comes from a Twitter user replying to something Ben Shapiro said. I can't remember what it was. Don't really need to know. Something pro gun. But this person wrote, "I understand the Second Amendment and all, but aren't you curious what it would be like having a stricter gun control policy? Even just a 1-year trial. The rest of the world copes well without guns. Food for thought." So we've already gone through that. The rest of the world, in fact, does not actually cope well without guns. There's, like I said, 5 of the top 5 mass shootings have all occurred outside of the United States. And then when you account for population, we are significantly less bad than a lot of other countries. What really got me was even just a 1-year trial, as if you could do something like that and it wouldn't become permanent, right? Was it Thomas Sowell who was like, there's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program. Yeah. So yeah, let's just disarm everyone, and then at the end of it, if we decide it doesn't work, I'm sure the government's going to give everyone's guns back, right? Just like they do with civil asset forfeiture and all these other things. Like they're really good about returning your property to you after they take it. There's websites literally where you can go buy stuff that the cops have confiscated from normal everyday people because it's past a certain time period and now they don't have to return it, and so they can sell it. There's also, you can go look up like cops that have taken like Ferraris and Lamborghinis from people, and then they've reskinned them with so that the cops have a Lamborghini for their patrol car. Just ridiculous, awful stuff. And I would posit this: it's like you look at Shanghai, right? Like people literally locked in their houses, starving to death, screaming outside of their windows, all of them, thousands of people screaming, saying, we need to get out of here. And they can't get out because the only people with guns are telling them you can't leave. And what are you going to do when you have a gun pointed at you? And that's at the end of the day, that's what government is. It's a gun pointed at your head telling you you must do something or else I will pull the trigger. And so the only way to even that out is if the populace is well armed, and then the government has to decide, maybe I won't point the gun at this person's head for this or that.
Yeah, I think a great highlight of that is the fact that, everyone kind of mocked the idea. And I think it's becoming more and more accepted, even in red conservative circles. I think it's always somewhat popular in libertarian circles, but now even in the Republican type circles, that your right to your Second Amendment rights that are, not given by the Second Amendment, but expressed in the Second Amendment, but they are God granted natural rights. That the right to a firearm is not the right to defending yourself in general. It's a right to defend yourself in general and against the government. And it is a check on authority and tyranny. And the dismissive way that people always talk about this is, like you would stand up against the army. And for one thing, I mean, it would be very, very costly for the government to actually try to, do some sort of invasion against its own people. You think about the fact that, you have to have a country intact in order to run a country, right? So it's inherently in its own, against its own self-interest to nuke its own, country on a mass scale. So there's those logistics problems, but then there's also, just the very fact that we haven't had things like what have happened in Shanghai, or again, more similar to our culture in the Anglosphere, Australia. They haven't been able to do that because they know that the US population is armed. So the world is not coping well with guns, and this dismissive idea that, the US just needs to join the rest and just try it for 1 year and that kind of thing. It's like, no. The reason they can't go in and enforce a 1-year trial of this is because we have guns.
Yeah.
Is because we have that check on authority. So, not that, it's not direct in this, but, just one of the things I was thinking about where it's like if they tried to mandatorily enforce a 1-year trial, they wouldn't be able to. And the very reason that they're unable to is because of the very fact that we are armed and it would be so costly and devastating. And that in and of itself is this check on the government that people like to mock and make fun of, to say that, like you could stand up to a tank. And it's like, they're not going to roll out tanks in the same way. And if it comes to that point, there would be such a united front from everyday Americans that it would be so costly and horrible and devastating for everyone involved. But it's just not something that even the government would want to roll with, I don't think.
My favorite thing when I talk with someone that is really, really pro gun control, because he talks about let's try a 1-year trial of having a stricter gun control policy. It's like, okay, what sort of policies would you implement for that? And sometimes they'll say things like, either one, they don't know, right? They don't actually know, or two, they'll say a policy that already exists, right? Like, well, we just need universal background checks, or we need to close the gun show, loophole.
Yeah.
And it's like, have you ever been to a gun show? Do you know like the people that are there? It's like the fact is this 1-year trial that you're talking about with stricter gun control policy, most of what you would want to be have during that 1-year trial is already there. It's already there, and it doesn't prevent any of these things from happening. In fact, you look at the safest states in the country, like New Hampshire, have some of the highest rates of gun ownership, but they're also the safest, right? And because you see that age-old quote, if more guns made us more safe, then America would be the safest country in the whole world. And it's like, well, technically, we actually are one of the safer ones, right? Like we've actually got less violent crime than the average throughout the world. I think we rank in like 83rd or something like that in terms of violent crime. So we're beating the average, which is awesome. And obviously, any sort of violence is a bad thing, right? We don't want that to happen, but it's like, how do you actually get to less violence? It's like, well, everyday people can actually defend themselves. The average time that a police officer takes to respond to like a home invasion I think it's like 12 minutes or something like that. It's much too long for you to be waiting for them to come if the person invading your home has intent to hurt you or your family. So yeah, I'm glad we don't have to try this 1-year trial. We have a lot of the 1-year trial in the free version. So let's cancel both the free version and the 1-year trial, or never even start the 1-year trial in the first place.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say is when you're talking about, how they don't know these policies that they would enact, or they list all these ones that already exist. You look at some of the regulations that happen on state levels that are just so ridiculous and goofy. You and I live in Washington state, and a couple years ago they passed a law that makes it illegal to transfer ownership of your gun to someone. Like, you can't just give your gun to a relative now, which was always a thing that was fine. And it's like, you think about it, and it's like, this is at best a very retroactive type enforcement thing, where this doesn't go to prevent crimes because it's only something you can nail someone for after the fact. Once the gun has been used in the crime, you could say, oh, you didn't have the proper paperwork filled out for the transference to happen between your relative and you owning, so you used this gun illegally. It's like, no one who was going to use a gun or give their gun to someone else is like, oh man, I would give this to you, but shucks, I haven't filled out the paperwork, and otherwise I was going to give this gun to you. And I recognize that you're unstable, and I'm okay with that, but this paperwork, man, like that's just not going to happen. And someone who's unstable and has a family member who owns a gun, they'll steal it, or they'll find some other way to steal it through their family means. Like, this does absolutely nothing except after the fact they can say, look, this person got their gun from a family member, and then you crucify the family member who legally had the gun and acquired it with all the right stuff. So so many of these policies are retroactive. They don't do actually anything to prevent the crime, because the ways that you prevent crime is by making sure that the areas themselves are actually safer. And that means having more people who are armed, who are responsible, good citizens. You encourage that from virtuous, righteous people. And you discourage things like gun-free zones.
Yeah.
Where people are just sitting ducks.
Yep. The gun-free zone with the sign that's supposed to stop it. This is a gun-free zone.
Yeah, exactly.
I was thinking about, then we'll get to the next one, but do you ever play PUBG?
I haven't, but I know of it.
Okay. Yeah, it's a battle royale game. It's pretty fun. But basically you land, and it's like, if you can find the gun first, it's like you're king in that scenario. But if everyone else has a gun, no one is going to be very bold about going in and attacking anyone else. In that game, obviously, the whole purpose is to get each other, and that's not 99.9% of gun owners don't view it that way.
Yeah,
but that's the point still stands, right? Which is like, when everyone is armed, or what is it? It's The Incredibles. When everyone is special, no one is special, and that's a good thing in this scenario, right? You want everyone to feel that way.
Yep.
All right, our last post. It's a picture meme thing from a story on Instagram, and this person wrote, "Today I thought about how my mom's one and only argument as to why we shouldn't have a stricter gun law was always, it won't get rid of guns. I know many with this take. It always struck me as odd hearing it from a mother. While that logic is silly for many reasons, it's very frightening. As a mother, how is the chance of children/people not being murdered less important to you than a gun? As a human being, how is the chance of children and people not being murdered less important to you than an inanimate object? If you are trying to find an answer to those questions, don't. If you're seeing the news regarding the multiple mass shootings and can still sit comfortably and tell someone that policy change is pointless, just know the way you think about values and treat other human lives is fundamentally flawed." Man, I mean, she kind of gives up the game when she writes that a gun is an inanimate object, right? It's like, okay, so banning an inanimate object, how is that supposed to help the cultural aspects of this, right? Like, that's what you got to deal with. Like, you look at, like, if I pointed out to her, I said, hey, majority, I think it's 90% of these mass shooters that throughout history that we know of, 90% of them came from a single parent household and had some sort of mentally unstable health condition. So it's like, what if we dealt with that? What if we encouraged and said, hey, you probably shouldn't be a single parent, right? Like, you should probably stay married and do all those things and encourage monogamy. These people would all over the place, right? It'd be crazy. It's like, no, that's not going to help. It's like, no, like, that's the classic thing they like to say, right? Like it's correlation does not equal causation. Um, just because there's a gun and a bunch of all these different things does not mean that that's the only reason why people commit murders, right? Oh, it's not like I picked up a gun and today I was like, oh, I'm going to go out and commit a bunch of murders. It's like, oh, I want to commit murders. How am I going to do that? Oh, I can get a car and drive through a crowd of people with, like that happened earlier this year. 40 people were killed with a car, or I could go grab a gun, or I could grab a freaking bow and arrow. More people die from blunt objects each year in the United States of murder than from assault rifles, right? Like an actual AR-15 style rifle. So there's just tons of logic issues in this, and it's just all an appeal to emotion. There's no substance in it, and it's all. And what's awful about it is it's an appeal to an emotion that is essentially, if you don't agree with me, you're an awful person that hates people.
Yeah. Well, that's just true anyway. That's always the case, right? When it's phrased this way, it's very interesting to me because it strikes me as very like it comes from the perspective of a Luddite almost. This idea that we need to make these policy changes to get rid of guns. We have to, and it's like it's not the most common way to think about it, but guns are a form of technology. It's an advancement of weapons of defense and items that are meant specifically to protect or cause harm as needed, right? And so to very specifically try to disrupt this technology from existing, it's a little bit like to me where conservatives are with big tech, where they try to put in these regulations, and it's like, look, this technology exists, and it's better to let people who are going to be able to use it responsibly handle this, and for there to be competition, for there to be checks and balances, and for sort of the laissez-faire free hand balance these things out. And I think that's true in the tech sector, and I think it's true in this sector as well, where you're trying to, it's like a game of whack-a-mole where you're trying to hit down all the areas where people can get guns, but they're just always going to keep cropping up. And the more you make it difficult to acquire, the more you prevent people who are naturally rule followers and virtuous people who don't want to upset the status quo to get them. But ultimately, with ghost guns, and that's kind of their colloquial name, but 3D printed guns and those schematics, like these policy changes are more and more inane and ridiculous and stupid and silly. And so this person's saying, the next time someone says that policy change is pointless, know that you think it's fundamentally flawed. It's like, no, maybe when I say that the policy change is pointless, it's because the policy change is pointless, right?
Yeah.
Maybe the policy change, 1, doesn't work, 2, is going to be outdated in a few years anyway, and 3, the fundamental assumption you're making is wrong, which is to say that a world without guns means that there's no violence or mass, murder or anything like that. All of these things are incorrect, wrong, and silly. But this person cannot possibly fathom a world in which their point of view is wrong in any of those senses. And so if someone disagrees, the way that they think about and treat other human lives is fundamentally flawed.
Yeah, it reminded me, like we talked about with the first post, very much of the COVID thing, of the if less people being murdered by a gun is reduced by us taking guns from everyone, why wouldn't we want to do that? And this type of logic only flows one way, right? It has no regard for the potential other consequences, right? Like unintended consequences. And you think about like Fauci recommending lockdowns, and now we're seeing the effects of those lockdowns, right? You've seen the hundreds of millions of people in the world that have starved to death as a result of those lockdowns. You've seen the increased suicide rates. I think it was like threefold in the United States, suicide rates and drug overdoses, deaths, and all those different things. And when Fauci's asked about, hey, did you consider the unintended consequences and impact on the economy and these other aspects when you're making these recommendations? And he goes, no, we just made it purely from a position of health policy. And it's like, dude, okay, like you can't do that, right? I mean, let's just grant you that government has the ability in the first place to actually solve all these issues, which it doesn't. But like if it did, you would want to take in all of the factors, right, to make a good decision. And so this person has no regard for the fact that like, hey, how many people, like if you took guns away from everyone, there's a potential for another person to be killed by not having a gun, right? Like just last week, we had a woman stop a potential mass shooter at a party in South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina. He pulled out his gun, was starting to shoot into the crowd, and she shot him before he was able to kill anyone. So, according to this lady's logic, her wanting to ban guns would have resulted in more people dying in that instance, and so therefore she doesn't actually care about other human beings. Like it's like you got to look at it from all angles and look at the actual impact of all these different things. And that's again, like because we're from the libertarian standpoint, you look at it. There's no single person that can assemble all of the variables and make a decision that accounts for all of them, right? And so the best way to do that is just to let individuals make those choices, and then inevitably it balances out and the best outcomes result. And that's how progress is made, is when individuals are allowed to take action, not when they're forced to not do or do something. So yeah, I think that's my last point on it. I don't know if you have any more.
Yeah, the only other thing that I'll add is obviously it's hard to predict these things from a standpoint of what could be or what could happen, right? You're never ever going to know these things. But
yes.
the one things that you also have to consider and think about is how often violent crimes that don't end up in murder, right? Like things like armed burglary or assault or robbery or property destruction, home invasion, all these kinds of crimes, like rape, all these things, how many instances of those are, one, deterred, and two, prevented from gun ownership as well? And it's in my mind, again, it's hard to actually definitively prove this kind of thing, but the rates of murder themselves probably stay somewhat similar to what they are, if not get worse, if you prevent gun ownership from responsible people. And those kinds of crimes only can get worse because in the case of the strongest argument for gun control is that, well, you take guns off the streets and then criminals don't have the means to shoot innocent people or commit mass shootings. So best case scenario for them, you have murders going way down. I don't think that actually happens because of black market guns and access, as well as other weapons for attack and those kinds of things. I think you just end up with a lot less deterrent and a lot less ability for quick responsive action from good people. But the problem is then when you take away all the guns and means of self-defense from virtuous people, the only possible outcome in terms of these other types of crimes is an increase, because some dude who's going to get a weapon off the black market still has the ability to go in for a home invasion and sexually assault people, or go in and steal people and destroy their property, or rob stores, or all these kinds of horrible violent crimes that aren't just about murder and aren't just from like a mentally deranged person. And the only thing you've done is prevented people in those circumstances from being able to adequately defend themselves. So there's almost zero room for any positive or neutral exchange in that category. Now, again, if you're talking about on balance, it's like, yes, I do believe murder is a worse crime than burglary and robbery. But the problem is that exchanging one for the other isn't a 1-for-1 ratio. When you get rid of gun control, you are not decreasing the murder rates and preventing, shootings from happening. You just aren't, and you end up with this absolute uptick in these other kinds of violent crimes. And so, again, it's hard to you can't really definitively show someone by the numbers in these hypothetical cases, but you have to appeal to some form of reason and logic and thinking through these things about how, in what possible scenario is this going to get better? And I just don't think it does. And then if you compare that to the stats about gun crimes and gun statistics with other, with what we do have, then I think you can make a pretty strong case to say that gun control would not actually help the murder rates in the U.S. But using logic and reasoning, it would in fact make these other crimes worse.
That's a great point. Awesome. Well, friends, thanks for hanging out with us for the show. If you have any feedback or thoughts, or if you have any other types of cringe posts that you'd like us to take on, be sure to message us on all of our different platforms. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll catch you next time.